we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Professor Jodi Dean, who has many superlatives, but who I will mention here is one of the co-authors of a recent book, Socialist Reconstruction, that addresses this exact issue. Look at you, 100% prepared, Jodi. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, really thrilled to be here. Thanks so much.
You know, we've seen we've seen a lot of images, but I think past couple of days, the just terrible scenes coming out of the state of California, people being inundated with rain, of course, yet again with extreme weather, we're hearing about climate change. And maybe just to frame the issue, Jodi, I mean, give us a sense of how, I guess this seems like a weird question in a way, but like how existential is it? Because it feels like it's becoming so normalized just to say like, it's just the weather goes back and forth and yeah, it may be getting worse, but it's almost like we're in a period of downplaying the seriousness of the crisis as the effects seem to intensify.
The effects are getting worse all the time. Let's just think about descriptions of what was going to happen in the future. So if we think back 10, 15, even 20 years ago, we were told there's going to be extreme weather events. There will be flooding. There will be terrible increases in temperature. There will be blizzards. There will be droughts. There will be fires. And we need to react then. We need to have reacted 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We need to do something. And the warnings kept coming and the warnings kept coming. And now it's here. Right. Climate change is a reality. It's a reality that showed, just a couple of examples, like 107-degree temperatures in Portugal last summer, record-breaking temperatures across Europe. Every decade for the last 40 years, each decade has been hotter than the previous one. The last 8 years have been the hottest decades in centuries. So, it has been the hottest years in centuries. So the reality is that the crisis is here. Now, whether or not people are grappling with that, it's hard. How do you live catastrophe all the time, right? It's like you still got to, take care of your kids and do the laundry and go to work and pay the rent. And so people do start to get normalized. But I think it's like we all know that when there's going to be a weather crisis, the weather channels go nuts and they're like, flooding here. And they make all these announcements, but there's nothing we can do. So in a weird way, it's like we're being kind of acclimated to catastrophe by being told all the time it's a crisis. But what that's obscuring is that, in fact, we can do something about it. That we can politically respond to this, but the way that the catastrophe is delivered to us blocks us from doing that, or tries to block us from responding in any kind of politically appropriate way.
So Jodi, let's talk about that, because at the end of the day, there's always a fear to just in the mainstream to just name what the problem is here, right? On a bigger scale. And you did hold up that book, Socialist Reconstruction. What is the problem here?
Capitalism.
Is capitalism. Talk about that. Explain why capitalism is the problem.
Capitalism prioritizes profit. It prioritizes capital accumulation, the benefit of the wealthy, no matter what, right? Make that money, get money for the stockholders, get money for the investors, get money for the owners. That's what matters. Their profits more than anything else. So then what doesn't matter? People and the planet. So as long as the global system is capitalist, which means as long as the United States is a capitalist country, we're not going to be able to address the climate crisis. Instead, what we're going to have is a kind of disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein mentioned years ago, that tries to use the climate crisis for more and more capital accumulation. Like, for example, using, trying to put countries in more debt, right? Say, we will extend you various loans and credits to help you revitalize your infrastructures, to respond. And this is particularly the case with smaller countries, with island countries, with countries that are called sort of less developed or developing countries. Right, the capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, want to use the climate crisis to further indebt them, rather than actually respond to the crisis in a way that will let them survive and have a decent life. So capitalism is the problem.
You know, Jodi, I'm glad you frame it like that. And one of the reasons I'm glad we brought up the book is it's not just sort of saying, you know, maybe the obvious that socialism, if capitalism is the problem, socialism is the solution, but what some of these things could actually start to look like. And I feel like that's super important, especially when we're talking about the climate, because it's such a big issue that it's sort of like knowing what an alternative could be, I feel is so important to building like the hope to help people fight in the here and now. So if you could talk a little bit about what some of it could look like if we had some solutions on this front.
Yeah, so I want to give people a kind of easy way of thinking about how we solve the problem. And that's decommodify, decolonize, decarbonize. I'll say it one more time because it actually shows that we can solve these problems if we decommodify energy, decolonize, the world, but the countries in our own country, and decarbonize energy. So what does decommodify mean? It means make energy a common resource. Don't let it be a commodity that is created for the profit of the few. Recognize that it's a common resource. It has to be treated as a public utility and democratically planned and managed. So the very first thing that's crucial for dealing with climate change, and that's possible here and now, is decommodifying energy. The second thing that's absolutely crucial is decolonizing all of our approach to energy and production. So what does this mean? Well, in 2010, there was a really important meeting in Cochabamba, Bolivia, that resulted in a people's agreement. And that people's agreement had a number of important premises and principles, one of which was the idea of the climate debt. And what the climate debt means is that the capitalist classes of the ruling capitalist and imperialist countries owe a debt to the rest of the world, right? The benefits that capitalism brought to the capitalist classes of the, we can say global north, we can say the imperialist countries, but the benefits were brought at the cost of the land and livelihood and life of people in the so-called developing countries. So that, first of all, it's crucial that this debt has to be accepted and acknowledged. And this is part of decolonizing energy. So what does accepting the debt mean? It means recognizing that we who live in capitalist countries have to hold the capitalist classes accountable, which means we have to let everybody in who has to flee from their countries because of climate change, maybe because of drought and they can't make a living anymore, maybe because of floods, like 1/3 of Pakistan was flooded this past fall. Maybe it's because of the increased amount of warfare as groups are struggling in environments that have become destabilized. Right? But you get the idea, like we're responsible for this. And so this means that we can't have we can't close off our countries to people that we actually are indebted to. We also have to recognize that the necessity of decolonizing energy and production in the United States as well. And this means acknowledging environmental racism. It means acknowledging sacrifice zones and the way that poor and working class communities are almost always in toxic sites. Like, how many times do you see rich people living next to an interstate highway or next to a garbage dump or next to a nuclear waste facility? You don't. So part of decolonizing our approach to energy is recognizing this aspect in in the United States as well as elsewhere around the world. There's more to all of this, but let me just do the third part so that people can, hold on to it in their heads. Decommodify, decolonize, and decarbonize. Decarbonize means keep it in the ground. Stop reliance on fossil fuels. And that actually can be done with a plan that says, let's say, we call it cap and convert. And over the course of 10 years, you stop producing and importing fossil fuels. And during that 10-year time, you redo the energy economy so that we're more and more relying on renewables. So you can do that with a plan, particularly a plan that involves the entire country, right? The plan that puts people to work saying, oh, we can retrofit our communities. We can be involved in reimagining work. We can be involved in reimagining our consumption. We can be involved in the provision of basic services to everyone. So it's actually possible, but only if we have a socialist country, only if we have a socialist U.S. Really willing to take on the climate crisis as the serious catastrophe it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point you made about like the sacrifice zones. And I mean, even when we think about the developing countries, when there's, like you mentioned, Pakistan, I mean, when there's a flood over 1/3 of Pakistan, or when there's really a flood anywhere in the developing world where the infrastructure is just lacking much more significantly than in the global north for obvious reasons, so many more people die, so many more people are displaced. Not to like say that it's not a big deal what's happened in California, but those same floods in Haiti would do way more damage, right? Or like just like a hurricane does way more damage in Puerto Rico than it does in the U.S. But I mean, all that said, there is one thing that's, a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious of your take on this, because you mentioned disaster capitalism. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the way that we could see a future. And we've seen this a little bit, but up until now, it hasn't been used or invoked for intervention. But where we could see a future where the issue of climate change is invoked by an imperialist government like the U.S. in an effort to justify some sort of intervention. And here, I'm thinking of the way that the issue of Bolivia, the issue of climate change in Bolivia and the Amazon was invoked at one point by the sort of SOS protesters to try to justify like right-wing politicians and these sorts of things. Like, do you see that? I mean, do you see that as a potential? And what do you think we can do to sort of, get ahead of that? Because I could see a future where that's used as justification for some kind of like coup or invasion.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. The climate writer and scholar Andreas Malm has been talking, and his research group has been talking about a kind of climate fascism that is starting to emerge, where right-wing political forces are doing exactly what you described, which is using the threat that's coming about, projecting the threat of the climate onto other people and saying, because of climate, we have to protect ourselves. It's a fortress mentality. And it's a fortress mentality that absolutely fails to recognize that the problem is capitalism. Instead, it lets capitalism remain and just says, well, we have to hang on. And so one of the ways that we can get ahead of that is by just going on, repeating nonstop that capitalism is the problem, right? That as long as there are corporations whose profits depend on fossil fuels, on inducing overconsumption, as long as these companies depend on exploitation, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. And this kind of climate fascism is going to try to, and then already is, trying to deflect the issue in ways that protect capitalism, as it always does.
One of the things I also want to ask you before we let you go here, Jodi, is I'm glad you brought up Bolivia, because, I think one of the sort of pernicious elements of maybe a more sort of middle-class climate politics is kind of, I call it sort of the politics of consumption guilt, essentially. But I do think that one of the issues that was brought forward by the movement towards socialism in Bolivia very sagely was this issue of buen vivir, a good life, of how to contrast the idea of living well to sort of capitalist consumerism, which we all know what that really means. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's an important element of how we conceive our future that's often sort of weaponized against the politics of doing something about climate change, but I think also could become very liberatory in a sense of really thinking so much about how we live and whether or not, we really are living well despite with all this stuff around us that we're told should make us happy.
Yeah, one of the ways that the book approaches this question is with the idea of universal basic services. And so instead of focusing on consumption and consumer goods, the idea is that much of what makes for a good quality of life are things like parks and green spaces and libraries and art and sports and good health and education and opportunities to be together, to build together, to plan together. Those kinds of goods, those are universal. They're not like privately owned. They're basic, like they're part of a good life for any and all. And so if we can orient our understanding of what an economy needs to do away from consumer items and toward the quality of life things that everybody values. That when people, if we just take one middle class example, middle class people, when they're looking for housing, look for good schools and green space. Right? Those should be available to everyone. They don't say, oh, am I really close to, like 15 stores or something like this? They might want good quality, healthy food, but they want clean air, they want green space, they want good education. That should be available for everyone. And an approach to building a socialist, climate responsible economy that uses universal basic services is really one of the ways that we can solve this problem and regenerate how we understand a good life.
Well, Jodi, really appreciate you as always. I think, maybe I'm a little biased here, but I couldn't recommend Socialist Reconstruction any higher. And I think it's good to finally have some solutions and some talk about solutions and not just the doom and gloom. So as always, really appreciate you being willing to give us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Great. It was great to talk to y'all. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.